Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is SockBot, and today I want to talk about one of the hardest platformers to make, and hopefully what we as amateur game designers, and possibly real game designers one day, can learn from how incredibly difficult this was to create. But hopefully you can learn something from this video about the 3D Sonic the Hedgehog games. Now, I don't normally talk about specific games in videos, and this entire video was born out of the idea of the difficulties of making 3D platformers, of which Dreams is absolutely littered with in a good way, so maybe just full of is a better way to say that. But if you enjoy this sort of discussion type video where I sort of take a game that I know pretty well in a series that I think is really important and really interesting to look at even after the sort of fall it went through, and kind of talk about how that applies to game design in general, and talk about all of the different concepts of game design that I have spent far too much time reading about and applying that to Dreams. Well, if you enjoy that sort of thing, feel free to leave a like down below and feel free to subscribe to my channel, but no pressure as always. I just, you gotta put that plug in there as a YouTube. It's required, and it would be weird if it wasn't here. You would also feel weird about it. Maybe not, but I would. Anyways, let's get into the video. So the 3D Sonic games are super controversial, and by that I mean most people hate them, but there are a few people out there that remember the glory days of Sonic Adventure 2, and absolutely the wonderful, well, wonderful to me environments of Sonic Heroes. So Sonic was such a fantastic series from the beginning, but it ran into a lot of problems very quickly. And you can see this with how a lot of people talk about the first Sonic the Hedgehog game before we even got to 3D, the first 2D Sonic the Hedgehog game, and how a lot of the levels after the first one are just not good. And the reason for that is when you create this game with the gimmick of moving really fast, you create a really exciting flow experience. Now, I want to very quickly describe flow for anybody that doesn't know what that means. Flow within a video game is the sense of progression and basically the ability of a game to make you kind of depersonalize, and it's the state you get in when you are constantly paying attention to the game and when you feel like you know what you're doing and when the game feels satisfying for you executing those actions correctly. And the better a flow state you get in terms of you just feeling like everything is moving and flowing perfectly with no interruptions, if you can get in a fantastic flow state for an entire level, for example, that means the game has done a really good job. And Green Hill Zone in this first Sonic game does a great job of that. The issue is, with this sort of speed that Sonic the Hedgehog introduced and made its full series gimmick, fortunately and unfortunately, you create the issue that this flow is so easily broken and so harshly broken by anything happening to Sonic at all. By him missing a jump, by him hitting spikes, by him getting hit by an enemy, and anytime that happens, this flow is broken. And I've talked about this in previous games, or previous videos rather, about how the Sonic games really struggle to get past this gimmick and to create a steady and feel-good flow state for levels, because although that flow state is enhanced by the speed and by the excitement that comes with perfectly performing a level, it is also just creates so much deeper pitfalls, especially in the literal pitfalls that exist within these games when Sonic is forced to stop for some reason or other. And obviously they've kind of mended this over the years, and they've created places where this works much better. For example, in Sonic Mania, with the whole dash ability and being able to dash from where you start, and all of the other things that they've added, like the jump and dash to attack, and the improved targeting they've added to that, has all improved on this formula for over the years. But that sort of issue with the flow state being fantastic, but it being such a harsh interruption every time you're damaged or every time you fail, well, that's where the game really starts to struggle. And in 3D, one of the issues that a lot of 3D platformers, even my gold standard Super Mario 64, ran into were camera angles. And that made Sonic games even more difficult, because when you were to play Sonic Adventure or Sonic Adventure 2 or any of these future Sonic games, the issue became that you were fighting against the camera angle as well as fighting to keep that flow state that you were so used to from the previous Sonic games, that eventually in 2D kind of worked out a good balance between flow and the awful interruptions that came with those original Sonic games. But when you're adding this whole element of fighting with the camera and adding an entire another dimension to focus on running in, you create all of these additional places where this sort of speedy flow state that Sonic does so well at, and where Sonic is performing at its highest in terms of a very fun video game, you just create so many more places for there to be pitfalls and for that flow state to be interrupted. And that can be very frustrating as a gamer. And I think that part of this was enhanced by the level design within the original Sonic adventure games, and how those actually did a pretty good job of putting the balance between the fighting sections where you were kind of doing minor platforming with the different enemies and the different robots running at you, and then the big grandiose sections of sprinting down a hill that is basically bigger than the entirety of San Francisco. And I think those adventure games did a pretty good job of dividing these sections and making sure that the player understood that they were meant to be played differently, and therefore to achieve that flow state and to enjoy that section of the game, you had to completely change your mindset between those two things. And I think that the interruption between the stand still and fight and dodge mindset that came with those fighting sections and the sprint and hit every platform and hit every speed boost that came with the more runny platforming segments, that balance and the break between them created some issues, and I think to some people probably did feel somewhat disappointing, but it also made sure that each level felt broken up, and it didn't feel like when you were running and when you feel like you were doing the right thing, you would suddenly run into an enemy and fail all of this, like actually some of the earlier Sonic games had. And so that's something that I think 3D did a lot better, but it also led into the future Sonics, and specifically, obviously, you know where we're going to get here, Sonic for the Xbox 360. Now, this was supposed to be a huge reboot and a huge, exciting game for Sonic to finally come into the next generation and to be a more visual-focused game, which I think was a fantastic thing to focus on, being how excited people were about graphics at the time, and on top of that, being the first 3D platformer, I mean, with some exceptions being cameo Elements of Power, if you consider that a platformer, which I know a lot of people do, and I think parts of it definitely are a platformer, but the first solely platformer with some minor combat elements to do that sort of HD treatment. And I think that because of the speed and the excitement, it just fit well together. And in general, it was a great idea. And it failed for a lot of reasons. But I think that one of the things that it failed most on was not revolutionizing the formula they had created within the Sonic Adventure series, and then even within the Sonic Heroes series, but instead going back to basics and also trying to merge everything together and adding things that just didn't feel like Sonic. There was so much more focus on hitting things at the right time and from dodging things, and in a combat system that is a focus of a game and that is a reason that people come to a game, that's really good. But in Sonic 08, people weren't looking for that. They were looking for the exciting parts of the game, which absolutely were fantastic. And that's where I actually come to defending Sonic 08, and that has to do with the big sections where you would be running between collapsing pillars, running around loops that were 10 times the size of anything anybody had imagined before, and all of these aspects of Sonic 08 were actually really fun. They were a buggy mess at times, but they were really fun. And I think that they did a really good job at remedying some of the issues with Sonic in the Sonic Adventure series, and even in some of the 2D Sonics where you would fall or you would get hit by something and that flow state would be broken, by adding more boost pads, by creating different sections of a platform so you could get from beginning to end in a level in like 4 different paths. And so, for example, if you were playing perfectly in a perfect flow state, you could stay on top of the pillars the whole time and hit every boost and finish the level with all the collectibles intact. But if you fell, it didn't mean the game was over. It could be a little bit disappointing and encourage you to play again and try again, which is something that's important to make a game difficult. You don't want a game to be easy to finish from beginning to end, because then, well, there's no time to build up flow and feel like you're actually accomplishing something. It's just kind of going through the motions. But I think that that was a really good way to remedy those big sections of disappointment from having to stop completely and either restart or start from that section again. and instead just kind of saying, oh, well, I fell into this lower path, so maybe I can come back to this level to explore the top path, and that's something that's really exciting about 3D platformers, is exploring the different sections, something that Sonic isn't really known for, but something that I think it could be in this sense, but also something that doesn't feel like you're going to completely fail the level. If you fall in the water, obviously you die and you have to restart, but like with Super Meat Boy, as long as those load times are fast and you can quickly restart and try the section again, there's enough checkpoints to keep up and enough difficulty in between those checkpoints to keep it interesting, none of which Sonic 08 did, but if it did any of those things, that could have improved those sections even more. And if they had just focused more on making sure that flow felt good, making sure that the load times were not ridiculously long for the purposes of HD, and obviously capitalizing on the wonderful segments that would not punish you for failing, but basically cause you to realize that you're not exploring the entire level and encourage you to go back. All of those things worked so well, and I think that those types of things you can absolutely put into your own levels. And if you are to create a game that really is focused on the platforming elements, and like solely the platforming elements, at least for those sections, you know, like Sonic, focus more on how you are reacting, or how rather your level and game are reacting to the player failing, rather than just saying, here's the objective, do it, and if you fail you have to restart. Because obviously, in the player's mind, that's not what they're going to be thinking when they're playing the game. You can create the challenge and play test it to know that it's possible, but to create a game where even when you fail, you don't feel like you failed, and you feel like you can move forward and give it a better shot next time, or even more importantly, just keep going and realize that you can come back and fix your mistakes later. All of those things can contribute to a good flow state and can really be important in a platforming soulful level, meaning the soul of the game is platforming, because obviously Sonic is not entirely platforming, and that's what we're going to get into next. But I want a little intermission here, because I don't want to just act like I'm crapping on all of the 3D Sonic games and saying they did a few things much better, but everything else was just so much worse. Sorry, there was a motorcycle driving by. But the one thing that I think that the Sonic 3D games did better than any other game, and something that they were criticized for all the time when they were coming out, especially with Sonic 08, was the characterization. Now, obviously, no, I don't think that we needed to add anime characters to what was essentially like a furry game, but I think that that's not really what they were trying to do, as everybody seems to be thinking. And I think that if you go off of what the Sonic team created in terms of the characters, Sonic being this kind of cocky but upbeat guy, Tails being the more calculating and quieter and shyer guy, and Knuckles being kind of the bombastic, more excitable character, all of those were different archetypes that a lot of people could relate with. I know that as a kid I related a lot with Tails, and now I relate a lot with Sonic, and I know that a lot of people related with Knuckles, and that's one of the reasons why people like Sonic and Knuckles so much, you know, alongside it just being a really good game. But I think that the characterization, clearly the team knows how to do, and clearly they know how to make fun characters, with possibly the small exception of that pink-haired girl. Not a great character, but like a lot of the other characters, even Silver to some extent, but Shadow the Hedgehog and his gang, it just, there's a lot of really interesting characters, and so you have to give them credit for that, and realize that one of the reasons people didn't like these characters is because it seemed like they were shoving anime into a Sonic game, when Super Mario had adult characters and more human-looking characters, like Peach, and let's say Waluigi and Wario, if you can consider them human-looking, compared to the Goombas and cutting in here because I couldn't for the life of me think of all of these during recording this video, but Bowser Jr., the Koopalings, all of the Koopas, I suppose, Yoshi, Birdo, there's a lot of weird characters alongside these human characters that for some reason in the Mario universe is totally normal. Toad? I mean, I get it's a hat, but is that normal? It's just a very weird thing that everybody had this backlash against these characters when perhaps the art team at Sonic had just drawn in their own style what they would have humans look like in that universe. Now, obviously, it's weird that Sonic would have any sort of relationship with a human, considering he is a hedgehog that talks, but I think that we've had enough conversations about furry things today, and on this channel in general, to have to go through that entire topic again. Long story short, the Sonic team does a really good job of characterization in terms of creating likable characters. Perhaps the script writing was cheesy, and perhaps they didn't need to add Silver, but at the same time, I think a lot of that backlash is not as important as the fact that the 3D Sonic games really brought so much character to what really were just 2D sprites in the past. Something that, honestly, even Mario doesn't do as well. And I say that as a huge Mario fan who, like I said, gold standard Mario 64, and they're able to do so much with the characterization of somebody that, like, literally just says Mario and various other words in a high-pitched voice. But, I mean, there's just so much more personality to the Sonic characters. Maybe it's because they talk. Maybe that's why people don't like it. It's entirely possible. And finally, we're going to get to one of the harder sections to talk about, because I know that a lot of people don't like creating raw platformers. They don't like creating something that is only focused on platforming. And something around Sonic, well, I mean, it makes sense that we talk about the combat, because it's good. I like the combat in Sonic. And this is going to be the most controversial part about this video. It's not me defending Sonic 08. It's not me saying that Mario doesn't have as good characterization as Sonic. It's saying that the combat in Sonic is actually a good idea. I think adding a gimmick like this to a game that already has a gimmick, which is the speed of Sonic, creates an entire other section that can be done really well. And you see this a lot in the speedrunning community when you're able to see someone that just targets everything perfectly and nails a combat section so impressively, and even fights some of the bosses in a super impressive way. The issue is that it's just not performing well within their hardware limitations or their programming limitations. I don't know what it is, but that dash, that jump dash that feels so good when you hit 8 enemies in a row with it, doesn't always work, and it never has. And it doesn't matter what Sonic game you go back to. Maybe Sonic Colors did an okay job of it, but honestly, I heard other people talking saying that they had a completely different experience where it was the worst it ever was. But the targeting has just always been off, and I think that that is what has kept combat in Sonic games from being fantastic. Because somehow they have managed to create a way that you can go from these big, grandiose, speedy sections of a platformer to these smaller sections that still feel platformy, kind of like Mario jumping off of people, but instead of Sonic dashing into people pretty flawlessly, except for that jump dash. It just doesn't work. And I feel like if it worked, this section it still feels so Sonic. The fighting sections just still feel so Sonic, and I think especially in Heroes, it did such a good job of switching between Knuckles and Sonic to dash off of people's heads and then punch them. It's just a small, easy thing to do that creates another gimmick within the levels. Do I think that this should be the focus of any Sonic game? Absolutely not. We had Shadow the Hedgehog, and they tried to add a lot onto that, and no. But I think that having this as a way to break up the Sonic games is a fantastic idea, and I think that it's something that people out there that are working on Dreams games could absolutely add to their games. I mean, for one, I know that within my game, one of the things I'm struggling with right now is using the character that I have and creating platforming elements that are interesting enough to keep a player going. For example, the different jumps within Mario 64 are a really good example of this. The boost pads within Sonic to create different speeds that can allow you to reach higher platforms. All of these things are just different elements to add to enhance the platforming and create greater variety within the platforming, as opposed to just jumping between here and there, always knowing your jump height, always knowing exactly how to get there, because there's only one jump. That's something that I struggle a lot with, and I think that it's something that Sonic has done pretty well. And adding a sort of combat section, for example, is a good way to break that sort of thing up, and therefore it doesn't force you to create 10 different jumps that are perfect for exact scenarios, and on top of that create all the animations out of that. Now, you'll still have to create combat animations if that's something that you want to do, but as we've seen with the Knuckles combat animations in every Sonic game ever, they don't have to be that complex. And it does create a little more complexity than I think adding extra jumps would, but it also is a really good way to break up your levels, especially if you're picking a character that already has combat animations. Now, again, there is a good and bad way to do this. You don't want to create these sort of smaller sections. If your game is a platformer, you don't want to create tiny sections of combat that don't feel right within the game. Kind of like I said, Sonic does really well with these 3D platforming and then 3D combat segments, minus the jump dash not working. you don't want to make it seem completely out of place. For example, I have this lovely little dog character who has a hat on that disappears when he gets damaged, or when they get damaged, I guess, and that is a really cool, interesting visual way to show damage, obviously, but it also reminds you that the character is important to the combat that's going on. If I were to ever add something to this character, I would have to either create a weapon that fit his sort of, like, I want to say, like, casual wear aesthetic, perhaps a giant book, maybe? I don't know. He seems kind of like a hipster. But I would have to create something like that that actually made sense, and then on top of that, create enemies that also made sense for him to fight. But also, don't worry too much about that latter part, because it's your world. As long as the enemies fit your world, it doesn't matter how weird they are. Just keep working on it. You'll find that enemies that you find online even can be tweaked in terms of colors, in terms of finishes, and even just in terms of minor sculpt tweaks that can make these characters fit your level. It's really not that hard, but it's definitely important to think about when you are trying to create a smaller gimmick like this, a la the Sonic games. But yeah, that's just what I had to say about Sonic and Sonic 08 and all the 3D Sonic games. That was a lot of Sonic, and hopefully can give you some ideas of what works well, and basically the reasons why certain things just don't. And hopefully you can avoid them when you're trying to create your game. But obviously, I mean, someone had the idea for Sonic. I wouldn't tell somebody to not use that idea because it's going to be tough. I wouldn't tell someone to not create a game because it's going to be tough, because that's not encouragement. If you have a really good idea that might fall victim to some of the more difficult things that Sonic has had to go through over the years to at least maintain relevance, but has kept it from being really good, still go for it. I think that Sonic is a very, very fine example, but maybe learn from it in terms of how speedy games and creating something that may feel really good when you're playing it perfectly can also just feel like crap every other time when you're not playing it perfectly. Something that a lot of creators have to pay attention to. Not me, luckily, because I'm terrible even at my own games. And so, well, it makes playtesting them pretty easy. But definitely have someone else playtest your games if you have the option. I do still, and they still find things that just don't work well and that need to be fixed. But, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. Welcome to the new channel of all Sonic videos all the time. Just kidding. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, like it. If you feel like subscribing, feel free to do that. I'm out of words today. But I hope you're doing well. I'll talk to you guys in the next video. But for now, goodbye, everybody.